Today, we're speaking about the Kamloops tragedy and Indigenous mental health issues that have followed as a result of this and other residential schools across Canada. I'm Heather. I'm the social media specialist for Qualia Counselling, and I grew up in Brantford, Ontario, where there is a large Indigenous population. I'm here with Charity Fleming, who identifies as Indigenous Canadian. Charity is a co-owner of Qualia Counselling Services with clinics in several communities, including Six Nations of the Grand River and Brantford, Ontario. She directs Qualia's teaching program, which includes dozens of cognitive behavioral therapy offerings in partnership with Wilfrid Laurier University. Charity specializes in treating trauma and Indigenous mental health and outreach. Just a few days ago, we learned about the discovery of more than 200 children's remains at the site of a former residential school in Kamloops, BC. And it has raised a lot of discussion about what took place during the time that these schools were in operation across Canada, as well as the continuing impact that these things have had on Indigenous people. Charity, what are your thoughts and feelings as an Indigenous person responding to this?
Thank you, Heather. I've had a lot of conflicting thoughts and feelings since we've learned of this discovery. Of course, like deep sorrow and sadness, and I want to express and give my condolences to the community of Kamloops, to the people and residential school survivors there, and also just Indigenous peoples across Canada. This is a heavy topic, and I think being Indigenous, it brings so much sorrow and heartache for so many reasons. For one, I think it's a huge trauma reminder for us. From that trauma lens, it's traumatic grief and a grief and loss reminder of what's happened in our history and the history of genocide in Canada. And I think it for me as well, there's anger that this happened, of course, but then there's these feelings as well, anger, that I'm happy that at least this was discovered, I guess, and happy that there's so much discussion now about these things, but this has been an ongoing issue for over 100 years. In the early 1920s, Canada's chief medical officer reported, and it's recorded, that more than 25% of children going into residential schools were dying there. And the official record is 4,000 deaths across Canada from residential schools. But I know that that's far, far underestimated. And we know that there was a lot of children that were just taken. The records were very poor. There was no burial records because Indigenous people weren't seen even as people. And so there's a lot of, I would say, missing people that we call the stolen generation, missing children. I know even in my own family, my Nokomis, my grandmother, she went to residential school, was taken to residential school. And she was one of 18 children, and only 6 returned to our home community. And so for us, it's this huge trauma and loss reminder. But there's still so many unanswered questions. Where are the other 11, great aunts and uncles that I have? Where are their remains? And I grew up in Northern Ontario in Sault Ste. Marie, and there's an old residential school there called Shingwalk Hall. And there's a graveyard there and, unmarked graves. And I've worked in Six Nations for over a decade, and, Mohawk Residential School in Brantford, they found many children's remains several years ago, and ongoing have found children's remains buried under coal ash and with, buttons from school uniforms. And this is a common occurrence. This was a common occurrence in residential schools. And I don't know that most Canadians know that. The stories are prevalent within our Indigenous communities. We know that there was far more deaths recorded, or far more deaths than what are recorded. But I don't think that this has been recognized. So it brings a lot of sadness. It brings feelings of despair. some feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, but also some feelings of hope at the same time. As much as I've, had negative images popping into my mind all week and, been mourning this loss, I've also thought a lot about the recent discovery of a woman. She was on the news of her daughter, that she looked for her, she looked for her daughter's remains for 50 years and finally found them. And as devastating as these discoveries are, it also gives us an opportunity to reconnect with our families and reclaim our heritage. So there's a bit of hope in that, even though there's a lot of tragedy as well.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge about this and your emotions. It's such a heavy emotional, it's just tragic. And I think we all see that. And I think some may see it as a problem of the past that we're just unearthing right now. And maybe that's all they see it as. But how do you see it?
Thank you, Heather. I mean, that's an interesting question. I think that's where some of those feelings of anger come from. Definitely residential schools were a huge part of what's recognized now by the UN and Prime Minister Trudeau as genocide that happened in Canada. They finally labeled that not long ago. But in education, I'm trying to constantly educate people about what that genocide means. And residential schools was one tactic of genocide. It was a horrific tactic, and I often, make the comparison of residential schools to concentration camps. But there's far more tactics. Even the reservation system itself, many Canadians don't know that other places in the world, like South Africa and even the US, based their forms of segregation and apartheid off of, or modeled them off of, our reservation system. And this is a dark history that I think a lot of Canadians need to be aware of, and that it's not just the residential schools, and it's unfortunately not just, the reservation system and those legislative papers that called for assimilation and genocide. But it's ongoing issues like treaty rights. I think of treaties all the time, and I try to explain to people, treaties are international, legislative documents that are supposed to guide international relations. And, we've been fighting for our treaty rights for over 100 years, 150 years. And, I think of Canada, if it was the United States or some other country where we weren't living up to our treaty agreements, there would be far quicker action to resolve those. And because these treaty agreements, they're still not being, the treaty rights are not being acknowledged, it's just ongoing issues. It creates ongoing problems and issues for Indigenous communities. But that's not it. I wish that those were the only issues. But there's things like Indigenous femicide, where many people don't know. Currently, Indigenous women die and are murdered at 16 times the rate of non-Indigenous women. Water issues. So we think in Canada, our quality of life is top 10, I think, in the world. When we compare that to First Nations, it's, in the 80s, maybe, similar to third world countries. And a big part of that is water. Across Canada, there's universal access to clean drinking water. And in Ontario, 40% of our First Nations don't have access to clean drinking water. So there's all these things. I mean, at best, we could call it neglect. At best, we could say, there's these political problems because of legislation and the way that Canada evolved, and the Crown, and how they passed on this kind of mess of legislation and treaty rights. But at worst, we could say that this is continued racial genocide. And so I think we need to all be aware, that residential schools, these tragedies are horrific, but these are ongoing issues that really demand the attention of everybody that calls themselves Canadian.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that Canadians don't know about, and there's so much history to reconsider, as well as what's happening currently. And I think we all feel the importance of recognizing this, and particularly with what's happened in the news recently. And we want to help, and we have a sense that we need to consider how we can, but we don't always know how. Mm-hmm. So how do you see us best moving forward?
That's a great question. And as much as I've been kind of railing on all these problems, I do feel like our generation now is more cognizant and aware and acknowledging these racial inequalities and injustices. And so that's very hopeful. And there's a number of things that ordinary people can do. And number one, from a psychological perspective, I encourage people to not turn away. So I think this is, working in mental health and from the framework that I do from cognitive behavioral therapy, I know that people just naturally, when we see something that's painful or uncomfortable, we just naturally want to avoid that thing. And I think, or I know that avoidance, it leads to more pain, more hurt, and, things not being resolved. So I encourage everybody, don't avoid the pain, walk with us, walk a mile in our moccasins, and really try to understand and empathize what our experiences are as Indigenous people. So don't avoid. My other small suggestions just for individuals is offer condolences. These are, events that are tragic, and for many Indigenous people, there's a grief response. We have Indigenous values of interconnectedness and community. And so it would be really respectful to offer condolences, to go to a local residential school and, drop off flowers or partake in the ceremonies or, the memorials that are happening there. And then other things, there's a lot, as I mentioned, of racial and other disparities that are across First Nations, between First Nations and or Indigenous people and Canadians. Do your part if you can. Talk to your local MP. Try to advocate for things like clean water or other things that you see, that are a priority within your local Indigenous communities. And then there's other things. So June is National Indigenous History Month. So, celebrate Indigenous history, share, take part in social media to celebrate our history, celebrate our victories, to, celebrate famous Indigenous people, but also to not be afraid to hear truth. And I think that works into our truth and reconciliation calls to action. Read those through, know what they are, know how they apply to you as a person, but also within the organization that you work. I know even for us at Qualia Counselling Services, we're still, trying to figure out how do we prioritize our response to truth and reconciliation calls to action. So these are all things, small, simple things that we can do. And we can post some of these suggestions as well for people.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your perspective on all of this today, Charity. For those of you watching, you can check out the description below this video. We'll share some helpful links with more information about the recommendations Charity has shared and other steps toward action. We also encourage you to share any other recommendations you may have in the comments below this video. Thank you.
Thank you.